part 2 of an interview with Dr. Katherine Horton on the criminal global economic system.
Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have Dr. Katherine Horton back on the show. Katherine, how are you doing?
I'm fine, and nice to have you. Nice to have the opportunity to speak to your audience again. I enjoyed it very much last time, the conversation we had. So it's a real honor to be back.
Well, it's my pleasure, and you're certainly welcome. Well, do you want me to call you Dr. Katherine or just Katherine?
Just Katherine, really. That's what I'm used to.
Okay. Katherine. Okay. So, Chris, you are a physicist, a particle scientist, and a former researcher fellow at Oxford in the United Kingdom. Your website is stop007.org. And, of course, that your background and that your website is part of what we're going to talk about tonight, because it is the intelligence agencies that are ultimately controlled by the global elite, the oligarchy that controls this corrupt global economy that we all live under. You've done a few talks recently regarding the nature of the global economy, kind of the history of war and crises and revolution as a form of asset stripping. That's a very interesting interpretation of history. It's something we don't get in the standard accounts and the textbooks, the History Channel and documentaries and these things, the sort of what's going on just underneath the surface, the intrigues of the banking system and the handful of families, perhaps 8, that control the banks. So, Katherine, let's talk about that. Asset stripping through war, crisis, and revolution, and how through that understanding we can get an understanding of the global economic system that we're all straining under today.
They went through all the company registers, the global company registry, and they mapped out not the ownership structure as in by shares, but more the directorships as well. The structure of board control amongst 43,000 of the biggest global corporations. Mm-hmm. And they discovered that I think 40% of them were all part of the same entity. It was one interconnected structure. And the way this structure achieved control over all these companies was through interlocking board memberships. So that whatever the share ownership might have been, the people who actually made the decisions, as in the board, they were entirely controlled by the by the mother companies and so on and so on. And through this process, this structure managed to accumulate power beyond its own finances even, because they might not have the share ownership to justify that amount of control, but they have controlled the board of directors. What that study actually shows, it came out in 2011, and as far as I'm aware, for the first time in human history, that's an accurate map of this global syndicate, the global cartel. It's now not a theory anymore, this is real, this is now proven. What that study by ETH Zurich leaves out are two things. So when you have so the way to look at this syndicate in terms of systems is like one system. It's like one big organism, okay? Interconnected structure. Now, once you control 40% of the biggest normal companies, if you like, those that are in the company registry, what's not said is that at that scale, you will also control most governments, and you will also control, and if you pull 40% of the profits from these global corporations, or more even, because the biggest ones have bigger share of the profits, this entity would also pool the profits from organized crime. So what that study actually shows, it's mapping out the visible parts of the organized crime cartel. That's another way of looking at it. So if we say, as we said in the beginning, there's this big organized crime cartel that has been doing asset stripping around the world. And it has been, massive centuries ago. So by now it's truly global and truly big. What we now see is it owns 40% of the visible companies. And when this organized crime cartel does asset stripping around the world, we expect the profits, at least partially, to go to these visible companies, and another part of the profits to go to the invisible businesses, which are organized crime. So I think this is how to explain that we have the Iraq war, and before we know it, we have these global oil companies, getting a share of the profits. And what's not said is also, for example, in Afghanistan, you have organized crime, getting a share of these super poppies,
Mm-hmm.
What's also not said is that there were reports that the farmers were forced to plant these poppies, and that these are genetically modified, hyper-performing poppies.
Wow.
And suddenly it all makes sense,
It's a business plan, yeah.
It's a business plan, exactly. And now the question that's really not just relevant, it's important for survival for us in the West is, what does this organized crime cartel want from us?
Mm-hmm.
What can it possibly want? And to answer that question, given the size of this big monster, we have to look at the biggest assets that we have. It wants those in Europe and the US. And now the question is, what are the biggest assets that are left? And I would be really curious to hear your answer, because the only things I could think of in the US, it would be natural resources, water and all that. And I suspect that these water crises, like in Flint, are just a precursor towards, privatization, absorption into this big cartel. And then also you have the big billionaire families in the US. They could be asset stripped. Here in Europe, and also in the US, it's the pension funds.
Mm-hmm.
So big insurance funds and pension funds. Now even more so the pension funds, because they are, pulled from the general population. So you're harvesting the work or the income of the general population. So I think we're looking at the pension funds, and then the billionaires, and here in Europe, the royal families. That's the only thing that's left. I think.
Now, of course, when we're talking about organized crime, we're not talking about Gambino, Bonanno, Lucchese. We're talking about perhaps Rothschilds, Rockefellers, Lazard, so, and maybe some families yet unidentified. That's the organized crime. We're not talking about Al Capone here. not even Meyer Lansky.
Yeah, they were small fry compared to this entity. That's the realization.
Yeah.
They were just local managers.
Yes.
And
they could be either rewarded or punished, depending on, how they operated. And I think within this, there's probably factions. So deciding what they're going to do there's probably an argument within this group of people about what exactly they want to do, what direction they want to go. I can only, we can only speculate. I don't go to the parties. But what are they looking for? Yeah, you're right. Control these resources under the guise of conservation, sustainability. We see that with Agenda 21 and sort of the promotion of like mini houses or box housing, micro housing, getting people off their land. I mean, they've done it in Africa. Just kick people off their ancestral homelands to asset strip. Why do Americans think they're exempt from that type of treatment from this class of people? They shouldn't. And if you're looking at operations or programs like Obamacare or the Affordable Health Care Act, it made everything much more unaffordable, but that's typical, is roping everyone into this insane medical industrial complex through insurance. That's a part of asset stripping right there, because everyone's overpaying for care they probably don't need or should have, because it's sick care. It doesn't make you well. It's all, and it markets the poisonous pharmaceutical drugs that the same cartel creates from petroleum.
Absolutely.
And labor itself is a huge value, perhaps the ultimate resource, human labor, human capital. And if you can asset strip and manipulate the social economic conditions of a target country, as we've seen, and as we mentioned earlier, in whether it's Haiti or Latin America, South America, Africa, you can then buy those resources on the cheap because those people are made desperate.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
That's what I'm looking at with what's the Macadoras, the industrial sites near in Ciudad Juarez in Mexico, where you have these factories that have been swamped with former, farmers that were dispossessed because of what happened from the North American Free Trade Agreement, where Mexican agriculture was then swamped with subsidized U.S. agricultural goods, which destroyed local agricultural markets. And
exactly.
And if you look at a lot of these industries, a lot of the stuff the equipment and the agriculture products, the pesticides they use, are all heavily subsidized by the taxpayer. So this isn't a market process. You can't have free trade in that environment. You can't have free trade in an environment of currency manipulation. When you have something like the U.S. dollar being imposed upon the world, ultimately through military force, because any country that challenges the primacy of the dollar finds itself being destabilized. It's not just a coincidence.
It's not a coincidence. And then when you come to realize that the U.S. has been set up and ruled by organized crime from the get-go, it's not even the U.S. government that does it. It's the crime cartel whose one tentacle is the U.S. government.
That's right, because the Bretton Woods system was set up by Harry Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes, who were working for the cartel.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And and I think you're absolutely right. This process of dispossessing people and then getting hold of their land and so on, and their labor is one method. And what you described in the US is also what's being done here in Europe through the privatization of everything. So the national health system in the UK. And I think there was a Russian general. I think his name was Petrov. I think he was also murdered after giving that speech. But he's still visible on YouTube, complaining about the fact that water has been privatized. And he said, "How come that in my childhood you could just drink water from the tap?" And it was fine and it cost you nothing extra. And these days, it's undrinkable and we all have to go to the shops and carry water home in bottles, and it's more expensive than fuel. How can that be? Now, that's the cartel in action. That's the asset stripping in action. And the same thing that has been done to water and many other things in Russia will be done now to the NHS, to healthcare in the UK, and many other things that have been taken out of the public hand of public stewardship. And that's one thing. Now, the pension funds are already private in most cases. And what they have set up there for asset stripping is also quite cunning. I think that was a multiple step process, which is in the olden days, pension funds were only allowed to invest in the safest assets. So these would be, what would they be? They would be the
municipal bonds or something. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you would have the country bonds. You would have, savings accounts. So literally the most boring type, return through interest income.
And I suppose also they would help local development in these things too.
Yes, exactly.
So finance was being recycled into the local, so it's being taken out. Yeah.
Exactly. And then the third pillar was what do you call them? Real estate. Because that typically just doesn't implode, within a microsecond. But then what this crime cartel did is that it started playing games and overinflate the property market. Mm-hmm. So now investing in real estate is lunacy, because the most properties all around the world are pumped up, and you have these housing bubbles everywhere around the world. And that's, the same in Norway and Canada and Israel, in Australia, wherever you go. And that has been done by this global crime cartel. Then we know what the value of these country bonds are. They are not worth much given how indebted the countries are. Again, an artificially created situation. And then, of course, the interest rates have been taken down to zero, mm-hmm. or even negative. So this meant that the typical investment pillars for pension funds were destroyed, And then, quite cunningly, they changed the rules so that pension funds were suddenly allowed to invest in the stock market. And that is the mechanism for asset stripping. That was the final step that was required, because now pension funds have been lured into making huge investments in the stock market. That's why the stock market is also kept so propped up. Mm-hmm. It is entirely to create this illusion of safety, to lure all these pension funds that basically month in, month out, people make their pension payments and they have to go somewhere. They have to be put somewhere, such that they create a return. And now a large fraction of the pension funds is in the stock market. And the problem with that is that within a microsecond, that can be wiped down to zero.
Yeah, because it literally is it's all imaginary paper wealth.
It is. And I think what many people don't realize is that I think at least since the 90s, so pretty much at least since computers were powerful enough to do this sort of maintenance, which I think was already the case in the early 80s. The 80s, not the 90s. So I think since the early 80s, the entire stock market has been an illusion and entirely run by computers. And that's because in the early 80s, you already had this cartel structure between the banks, for a long time. They do trade with each other. Any transaction on the stock market that you make, you do through a broker who does it through a bank. So the banks set the prices, or the stock market prices are always set on margin. So that's the instantaneous volume, demanded and sold. And through their monopoly position, these banks can set the price of the stock market wherever they wanted to, because they sell goods to themselves. Mm-hmm. So they sell something from their right hand into their left hand and back again. And then on these mega trades, normal people and companies sit and they make their little trades as well, And through that process, through controlling the bulk, the banks can control any stock market price. And they do. And the only thing that they needed were computers, fast enough to handle all that. And that has been around at least since the early 80s. So that means that since the early 80s, the stock market has been totally an illusion,
Yeah. And of course, if there is a coming downturn, there's always a few people who are ahead of the game, and they can sell before the prices drop, and that's the old pump and dump scheme.
Exactly. And they are ahead of the game because they know how the computers will be set next week.
Because ultimately, in the day, human beings are setting the computers.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's whoever controls the computers knows what's going to happen next week, because that's what they're going to program. And exactly through these means, the banks can asset strip the pension funds, because they can engineer this downturn. They know when it will come, right? So they will sell all these shares ahead of time to these pension funds, and it will be the safest looking shares that will be sold. And then, you engineer a crisis by setting your computers such that the price of key things, where where the positions of the pension funds are, because they trade through you. And then you just set it all to absolute zero. You create a panic. Pension funds will have to start selling, because I think there's still regulation against these devastating losses. So they are forced to clear, they are forced to sell it back to you. And then you buy it up and then you resell it, mm-hmm. That's it. And you win on the down and you win on the up. And I think this is how the pension funds will be asset stripped. And then the last thing is, how will they asset strip the billionaires and the royal households, and that's where it starts turning bloody.
Yet another phase of revolution.
Some sort of revolution. And there, as far as billionaires are concerned, there are some examples of billionaires being asset stripped. For example, in Britain, there's a famous case of Gerald Carroll, and I think they asset stripped him. Literally, they cleared the deck by, he had this entire empire of companies, and I think through Companies House, they just created companies that sounded like his companies, just had a spelling mistake in the name, and or slightly altered name. And then bit by bit, they transferred assets between these companies. And when he was reading the statements, you wouldn't notice a spelling mistake.
Something so crude, really?
Yes, you
simple
would be
rather.
surprised.
I mean,
yes, but
wow.
it wasn't. That was one thing. And if you search on the internet, you will still find traces. Look for the Carroll Foundation and Gerald Carroll, and the entire fraud through Companies House. It's the biggest, the most egregious fraud in the history of that sort of stuff.
Was there any litigation?
Yes. Well, I think what the status I remember is that all these files are with the Metropolitan Police and the FBI, which means that the files have been handed into the organized crime cartel, who will then, look at the great job that they did and laugh.
Yeah, it's like I don't know how familiar you are with the 1995 bombing of the After Premura building here in Oklahoma City, which began the age of domestic terrorism. It's been pinned on one Timothy McVeigh as a lone nut working with two other guys. But if you look at the story, it's a much deeper, much more interesting story. One thing is the forensics of the site just doesn't justify the truck bomb theory. The building exploded from the inside out. But also the truck bomb couldn't have done that amount of damage. A ammonium nitrate bomb just simply couldn't have done that. But one of their theories is that there was a lot of evidence stored at the After Premura building regarding Whitewater, the Clintons, Mena, Arkansas, the Bushes, and that gets in Iran-Contra, cocaine, and what was going on in the 80s with the CIA importing cocaine to fund the Contra operation. The Iran-Contra, the true story behind Iran-Contra, but the building blew up, the evidence was lost.
Yeah, and then all the windows blew out and, the shards on the street. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's one element to 9/11 too, as far as WT7 and a lot of evidence regarding financial, massive fraud on Wall Street and Enron and things like that were destroyed in Building 7 that collapsed, symmetrically and in free fall. Wasn't even hit by a plane. So you get that sort of pattern.
Exactly. So you also, I think you mentioned it. You also said it at the Pentagon, and it was at the Pentagon where they hit this missile, what looked like a missile, hit the bit of the building where all the admin stuff was for the $9 billion. That's
supposedly.
Sorry, not $9 billion, $9 trillion,
no.
Right?
Well, then it was $2.2 trillion, admitted by the Secretary of Defense on September 10th. On Monday, he gave a press conference. Next day, the Pentagon was attacked by supposedly a commercial jet airliner, for which there's very little evidence of ever being there, but that's a whole other can of worms. But yeah, you're right. The area that was hit was this area that was investigating all the financial fraud. And of course, if you get into, we're talking about asset stripping and use of war and crisis. Of course, the Pentagon is the house of war, and the Pentagon budget is huge. And there is much evidence there that there's been massive embezzlement occurring at the Pentagon because they've never been able to sustain an audit. They have never been audited, and you're talking now things like close to $8 to $9 trillion that's unaccounted for.
I thought so. The biggest sum that I've heard, I think Katherine Austin Fitz quotes the sum of $40 trillion missing since the mid 90s.
That's the economy in general. That's because she was talking. I think that's what you're referring to. Is she's talking about in general everything just unaccounted for, and that's also counting. I think she's also including that the bailouts that occurred after the crash of 2008, the Federal Reserve and these 16 to 20 $1 trillion in currency swaps that are and literally you talk about the secret society. There was a congressman who had the temerity to ask the then chairman of the Federal Reserve, Benjamin Bernanke, can we look into this to see who got the money? He says, no, you can't look at it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a secret. And it's a secret.
Yeah. It's a secret because it has to be, because it's so criminal. As soon as something's a secret, it's criminal. It has to be a secret because it's criminal.
And you get in this pump and dump thing, isn't it? Because you have, the Great Depression, 1929, and it was foretold because it was Charles Lindbergh, the famous pilot. His father was a senator. And he said, with the creation of this Federal Reserve, the central bank, booms and busts will be scientifically created from here on out. And, of course, then not too long after that, you get the Great Depression. And with the Great Depression, it's brought on by this credit boom of the 20s, inflation boom of the 20s, that the Bank of England and the New York Federal Reserve orchestrate through Benjamin Strong working with Montague Norman, and this pumps up the global economy ostensibly to prop up the English pound. But in order to do that, the US dollar had to be devalued. And, of course, this creates a stock boom in the United States and also globally. Then it crashes. And then nothing is done to arrest the panic when supposedly that's what the Fed was created to do. They let all these banks collapse, all the small banks, by the way. And that crash created a huge consolidation of industry and banking, which, again, what you're talking about, what this is all about. They buy everything up on the cheap.
Exactly. And the assets, I would say, and then the customers of those small banks migrated into the big banks, the big cartel banks. Exactly. And, given that the situation is this, and we are now faced with this, I think, another big round of asset stripping here in Europe. And that's, by the way, what everything else ties into. So the directed energy weapons and the attacks on me and other scientists and the population in general that we talked about last time is also entirely integrated into this. It's a warfare system that will be used to kill off absolutely everybody who goes against this crime cartel. And now the question is, and this is really the $43 trillion question.
Literally.
Yes, literally. And also the question of how to save our lives, because, you and I having this sort of conversation and putting it out on YouTube, we're not to survive very long. Certainly not if we have, any sort of, notable, viewership. So the question is, how can we cycle out? For us to survive, we have to cycle out of the current system. And the real questions are now, and that's what my colleagues and I and many other people are working on, is how to do it, And I think the overall big picture is that this organized crime cartel has to be cut up, truncated, and shut down. And one of the things is that we certainly have the technology to do that. We actually have the technology, and we also have the manpower, but the people who could do it are not, they have been taken away from the resources, So one example is Professor William Black. He was working for the regulators, and he was talking and testifying to Congress about this rampant criminality and about how to shut it down, in the banks. But he has been removed, and he put it very well, because he said when you have a regulatory body, there are very few individuals who have the sort of caliber and intellectual wherewithal to take in all the complexity and actually bring about successful prosecutions and just know what to do, know where to look. And as soon as you take them off the case, the rest of the people will not be able to pull it off anymore. So you only have to hamper very few people to entirely cripple a regulatory body. So we have now this world where we need to regulate the banks. We need the FBI back. We need the police stations back. We need an actual real anti-terror unit. We need a real intelligence agency, but we don't have any of these. And now the question is, how are we going to build one or build these things, And I think that there are two ways to do it. Number one is recapture. We have to literally recapture the FBI, because right now I think they seem to, groom and hire organized criminals,
That's right. The former director was on the board of HSBC, Comey.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, oh, wow.
Yeah. But, enough said about that, right? What more does one need to know? Exactly. So that's not possible. And I think we have to do this at the local level as much as at the state level. And, so one is recapture. The other thing is we have to build, new structures in our society. We have to build new crime fighting structures that for the time being are also independent of the police. So this is why, when my colleagues and I realized that, we can't, none of the police stations anywhere in neither the US nor in Europe actually assist us with the crimes committed with directed energy weapons. We had to build our own investigative team, So we are now running a criminal investigation. We have to DIY it. And we got pretty far. And, the actual core group is 5 women, and we're assisted by, microwave weapons experts and retired intel agents in the back, and some active intel agents. But, people have to imitate that, in the policing arena and in any other field as well, also in terms of financial regulation. Yeah,
I guess one hope is that there has to be a lot of people within this network or the agencies that they control that, who went to work for these agencies with the best of intentions and now find them, or they themselves are developing a consciousness of this reality and may be willing to assist in undermining it. Because at the end of the day, they need their minions to do their bidding for them. And if many of these people, if they realize what's going on, won't be willing to do it, and they're willing to help the other side, so to speak. There's also the constant risk of infiltration with that, though. You have to be mindful of. That's
absolutely, and I think that's what we all, and that has been happening, by the way, certainly in all the political movements of the recent past. That small groups of people start out with the best of intentions, and as the team grows and as time passes. Again, the intelligence agencies have a monopoly situation, and any small players can be just taken over and infiltrated, with the blink of an eye. And ultimately what it will come down to is how are we going to build resilient systems in the 21st century? Mm-hmm. That's the ultimate question. And one of the things that we have all learned by now is that pyramid systems are not resilient. In fact, they are deep capture machines. They attract psychopaths to the top. They attract serial killers and criminals. So we have to move away from these pyramid organizations, which will be very, very hard, because actually pyramid organizations are so prevalent because they tap into our genetic predisposition. Mm-hmm. And that's human beings being group animals. We are genetically primed towards following a leader, and, this sort of group dynamic arises in small groups very quickly, and then these small groups can be organized into bigger groups where these leaders in turn follow an even bigger leader, an even bigger alpha animal, and so on. And one of the things that I found actually fighting the intelligence agencies is that, and it goes to the heart of genetics actually, I found it easier to find women who were willing to go up against this than men. And part of it, I think, is also because men are group animals. They have to, that's their strategy. They organize into gangs for protection. But women have a much higher likelihood of being lone fighters because they have to be, they have to protect children even when they're on their own. Mm-hmm. So I have found, not just a handful, I've found many, many more women who are literally willing to take on the biggest players, and they are fearless. But we have found some men, but not that many, actually. And I think that goes to the heart of psychology. So, and upbringing. But as soon as you are aware of this dynamic, you can of course counteract it consciously, and, what we actually need to do is tell these men that they have to stop listening to their leaders. They have to think for themselves. And especially in the military and the intelligence agencies, because those people are groomed to follow leaders, and it's totally beaten into them, And in the military, even more so than the intelligence agencies, because the intelligence agencies also farm people for cunning and deception and, this sort of stuff.
More dynamism, I guess you could say, whereas they just follow orders, and that's all part of wearing the uniform and being part of the esprit de corps or Semper Fi or
Exactly, marching in lockstep and all this sort of stuff. So one of the things that also Dr. Paul Marco taught me is this awareness that small groups, small autonomous self-organized groups are much more efficient and much faster than these big monolithic organizations, because they are all centrally controlled, so they have to wait for commands and, kind of a war plan from the central control. Mm-hmm. So really, what I would say is what we need all around the world is for small groups, and ideally, I would say 3 to 5 people. 12 is really the absolute biggest. Then you're looking into serious danger of infiltration. But, you have to find 3 to 5 people who you really, really trust and get going and start building the institutions that you want to have, And that can be many things. It could be a small, a small system of cooperation, even a small system of maybe co-funding each other, maybe a mini proto bank, something like that. Or it could be an investigative team into anything, financial crimes, pedophile groups, criminal investigations, and many other things. Also, the legal profession has to be totally reworked because they got themselves hogtied, actually, by their own nonsense.
Yeah.
That's a rakish way of putting it, but it's true. For example, in Britain, there was a big and very laudable drive by, I think it was Lord Wolfe, if I remember correctly. He started the Plain English campaign, or maybe he didn't start it, maybe he popularized it. And that was his effort to make his colleagues stop talking gibberish, and actually start talking and calling a spade in court. And he had some success, but there's still a long way to go. And of course, part of the entire point of the legal system is obfuscation. Yes. At this point in time. It is still run by the cartel. In fact, in England, the Inns of Court are entirely on the territory of the City of London Corporation. Mm-hmm. The front for this organized crime cartel, right at the heart of London. So what to expect from that lot, But again, just like with the intelligence agencies, I hope that also amongst the, partially also psychopathic lawyers, there are at least some people who have their heads screwed on and realize that the system is now at breaking point. So we actually need also small groups of lawyers who are willing to start tackling these issues. And I think, I can't remember the year, maybe it was 2013 or 2014, I have to look it up. One of the Supreme Court judges, it was Lord Toulson, gave a speech, and it was about, the complexity in law. And he raised the point that now the number of statutes and secondary legislation published every year in the UK is so overwhelming that people can't keep up. And worse than that, you're generating this sort of legal webbing, that sometimes produces just nonsensical situations where people cannot find out what the law says. They cannot find.
Which we can be used as a sort of sword of Damocles, because at any one time you can be charged with a felony or a crime, and you don't even know what the law is. And we're not talking about theft, rape, murder. We're talking about the arcana of regulatory laws which carry criminal penalties, financial things like that, and and it's such that there's a book written here called 3 Felonies a Day, and it's talking about how easy it is just to pin a felony on any person just going about his everyday business. And prosecutors are told this. So if you catch the eye of a prosecutor, all they need to do is focus on you for a little while, and they can pretty much, creating through legal fiction some interpretation of the criminal code, hit you with with an indictment, and all of a sudden you're stuck trying to pay for a legal defense, which most people cannot afford because the legal cartel is a cartel. Prices are too high to purchase adequate counsel, so you plea it out. And you go to jail for 2 years instead of 10 years, and and this is how the system works. And just the whole complication of the criminal code, whereas it's become so complex, something as basic as the criminal code, the average person should be able to understand it, so he knows what to do and what not to do. But they've created this, it's like the Roman emperor who, I forget which emperor it was, who wrote out a bunch of laws and then posted them really high up on a pillar so no one could read them. So someone broke the law. Oh, look, there's a law.
One. We should suggest that. We should suggest that to Parliament.
Yeah. Was it Sulla? Maybe even Sulla the dictator. I forget who
Yeah, I think the modern equivalent would be to use really, really small font that even if you blow up the PDF, you still can't read it.
Yeah. I mean, look at the tax code. There's criminal penalties for the tax code, and the IRS can't even tell you what it means. And they can, and to them, it's up to them to prosecute civilly or criminally if there's a dispute over your taxes. It's tax fraud or environmental. There's all types of environmental laws or such. And because the important point, and Catherine Austin Fitz makes this point, is all this red tape doesn't apply to the big guys.
Yes,
it's the little guys. Yeah.
Exactly. And what it's meant to be, it's meant to be a rose bush thicket, thorns everywhere, and you're entirely trapped, and I think the example that Lord Toulson had was from the welfare, the benefit system in the UK, and he said that there were cases where not even these highly paid lawyers and the judge in court could work out what someone's benefit entitlements were based on the law, because it was just so crazy, such a mess. And that's actually a natural system process. So what these people are complaining about, funnily enough, you get there to this end state, even without a crime cartel trying to interfere. But then when you have this organized crime cartel trying to asset strip poor people, then yes, that will be just accelerated. And the question is how to step out of all this. How are we going to reverse it? There are some problems that are easy to answer. So, for example, in the financial realm, one very easy way to cut out all this criminality or severely reduce it very quickly is to impose that absolutely every public body, and certainly also the Inland Revenue and the government needs to have entirely public accounts. But so public that you know exactly what family X paid in tax, because that goes into the common, pool of money, so that you can track any family's input in tax into the system, and then track it exactly where it went between departments. And every single time the government pays a contractor, you should be able to pay that, so that you can. Every person in the country can just log onto a website and track all the sums. We do have the technology. We even have the technology to simplify the cross-checking, the big picture checking. And I think that would be the most important crime-fighting tool for the 21st century. And the only thing you need is that everybody accepts that what they pay in can be tracked, but you don't even need that. It's already enough to start off from the inputs, Inland Revenue inputs, and say, okay, we have collected these so many taxes, as a first step to preserve everybody's privacy. You say, okay, this is how much we've taken in. Now, where does it go from here? How much does every department get? Which contractors get the money? Because then what happens is that there's a lot of natural cross-surveillance in the population. Okay, so that's precisely what the cartel is now using when they're building up these big gang stalking and COINTELPRO thug networks. They tap into a natural curiosity of people. But if we applied that to our biggest organizations, also police forces and hospitals and even the military, what you would end up with is that competing companies would keep a very close eye on each other. And if there's any sort of malpractice, they will flag it up just to put the dagger into each other's back. And the same will also be true of local companies, small local businesses, anything, your local council. And if we think about it, it's a bit of a, surprise that this hasn't been done yet, And I think if we really want a revolution and we're thinking about what should be our demands in this revolution, one of them should be 100% public accounts for all public institutions. And then also for all public corporations, so that you can track every expenditure, even down to the last pencil that this company bought, And once we had that for all the governments, the Western governments and the public corporations, that would already go a very long way. And then the question is, and actually what it gets back to is that organized crime can't just sustain itself by itself. At some point, it has to interface with normal companies. So if you're tracking most of the public financial flows, any sort of illicit flows they won't show up completely, but you will have a very good hint, if something dodgy happens. So that's, I think, the first demand. And, yes, I mean, one of the things I'm working on right now is how on earth to cycle the legal system back to sanity. I haven't gotten a full answer yet, but, that's what we have to do.
The difficult thing is sort of, mobilizing or getting the attention of the general public, or at least a sizable portion of the general public, because a lot of interest is kind of inchoate or kind of there, but how do you mobilize it into a potent political force, then affect it? Because day to day people are simply overwhelmed by it all. They're not keeping track of it all. Who's really keeping track of what City Hall is doing? And, I mean, you have all types of decisions made at the local level, like when the police decide to purchase equipment like Viper equipment, which is the surveillance equipment, or the electronic license plate monitoring. There's no meeting at City Hall. There's no vote. It was just done administratively, and pretty soon the decision is taken. Same thing. There's been some of a kickback regarding automatic traffic cameras in some areas. But nevertheless, these things are just implemented locally, and there's no one's really involved in these decisions. And a good example is just, we mentioned earlier, the missing trillions at the Pentagon. You'd think there'd be an outrage, public outrage at this, but the public just collectively more or less yawns at it because, the next day 9/11 happened.
Yes.
And if you have, this is the problem we have, because the cartel itself controls the press, at least the legacy press, the mainstream press. It controls media and culture, and all these things are weapons that are used against us to deny us of our consciousness, to dumb us down, to entertain us to death, more or less. So we're not really concerned with these things, however interesting they are, and the profound effect they have on our individual lives. People would rather sit back and eat the junk food and be entertained by it all. And there's only a minority that's even interested in this stuff, and hopefully it can be an irate minority, and enough of a minority that can affect some change. But without any outrage,
but I think,
and there should be outrage. I've explained. Individual had this experience where I'll be talking about this, and be talking to an individual, a family member who's incredulous of what I'm saying, and I'll lay out how drug money is laundered, through the banking system and into 401ks, and how it's done, how criminal it is, and these things, and how the 401k you have is being capitalized or funded through drug money. And there you are talking about the evils of drugs, and see how bad the system is. And then I'll see their eyes glaze over, and they say, "Well, I don't want to hear about it. I don't know what you're talking about," even though it's not that complicated. But because people don't want to face up to it, they work 45, 50 hours a week, come home, and they want to be able to prop their feet up, watch some television, or just get along with life, take care of their kids, take their kids to baseball practice or soccer practice, and have their events. And everyone gets so involved in their own individual lives, whether or not their kitchen is going to be remodeled or something. But and this is how they fall prey to these things, because everyone's so atomized.
I think so, actually. Given the number of kitchen remodeling programs, maybe that's one of the globalists' biggest plans.
Oh, yeah.
With our kitchens.
Oh, that is. I mean, that's not funny. There's a lot of cultural programming in those cooking shows, and researchers have uncovered Pentagon and intelligence agency influence in those programming.
Actually, I think you might be onto something, because I remember in my childhood, no one used to care that much about the kitchen.
No,
kitchen was like something that was like your bathroom. I mean, you had one, and that was that.
Now people, look at my kitchen, and then I think one of the cooking shows was Julia Child, and her promoting French cooking, and here in the United States, of course, it turns out she was an OSS CIA agent.
That's hilarious. That's absolutely brilliant. I mean, really, I think I just call them, the cartel of shysters, these intelligence agencies, but they do have what I also call their shyster arsenal. And I have to say, some of their tricks are just, I mean, truly, I admire them. I mean, yes. They're evil bastards, but I do admire their genius sometimes.
It's about running the world. And if you're going to run the world and exploit the world, you're going to have to know people's weaknesses.
Yeah.
And so they hire ethnographers, psychologists. The CFR will bring in Angelina Jolie, and she'll talk about how she's carving her body up to fight cancer.
Yes.
And these celebrities may not even know. I mean, they could be unwitting. They're just brought into this outer circle and feeded and surrounded in luxury, so they're willing to do it. And they think they're important, but they're really not important. They're out there promoting. They're the PR people. But it's the control of the media, these things, celebrity, I mean, Hollywood, geez. I mean, television, what that's done to the public, the weapon that's been.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And if you chart the history of mass communication, it's always been a strong interest of the intelligence agencies of the military, for purposes of manipulation. And the news media all grew out of, at least in here in the United States, Sarnoff at ABC, it was William Perley at CBS. They all came out of the World War II intelligence agencies, psychological warfare.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, now that we have cottoned onto their game, I think we can go back. I mean, that's the beauty. That's the beauty being on our side, because once we figured out what they did, we can go back in time, actually analyze it. And I think the key is to realize what weakness of ours have they tapped into when they pulled it off. And I think now the name of the game is to deplete to deplete their shyster arsenal.
Yeah.
They have a couple of tricks up their sleeve, and I admire you because pointing out this thing about the cooking programs and remodeling your kitchen. I mean, just think about the funds that are sunk into kitchens,
Consumerism.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you should I think every family should just tot up how much money they spend on their kitchen cupboards and electrical appliances.
Oh, I find myself in the trap. I walk into my kitchen and look at how old it is. I get upset. Now, why am I getting upset about that? The cabinet's still open.
Just walk into your living room, spend more time there,
I need a new roof, but that's more practical. But the whole point is, and it's... Because it's aspirational advertising or manipulation, where this is why celebrities, you hear about how much they're making and how big their houses are.
Yeah.
Why do I care how big Brad Pitt's house is or how many bathrooms he has? I mean,
exactly. But you know what they are playing? It is genius, because what they're trying to do is deplete your assets by sinking them into stuff that's secondary, that's not really important.
Mm-hmm.
And because if we did not do that, if we did not sink our assets into nonsense we don't need, we would actually have all this surplus money, which we could either donate to people who are really starting something new, say they are starting a local newspaper, or they're trying to create a new local bank. And we could start investing in that and actually start using the funds we have to build something. But instead, we should part with the money we have, put it into something that's an object that, can make us maybe a milkshake, but not much more. We can't sink it into something that could possibly become dangerous to the criminal cartel.
Mm-hmm.
So once we realize that, all we have to do is turn it around and think, okay, at the end of the month, how much money do I have? Or if you go shopping, and you think, I really would like to have the newest flat screen television, maybe just don't get it. And you already have $1,200, that you can use.
Don't watch television. Then you have that time back.
Exactly. And get your time back. Very important. In fact, I stopped watching television about a decade ago, or more than that, almost 2 decades now. And there's a huge difference between watching television, whereby you just press a button and you let yourself be, programmed. That's why they're called programs, right?
Yes.
You let yourself be programmed by somebody else's choosing, or else you go on the internet and you make a conscious choice by typing something, a search string into a search engine.
And for now.
Yes. For now, exactly, yes.
Yeah.
And then you take your own path through, what interests you. And actually the first, stumbling block that most people come up with when they try to detox, from television, when they actually want to, it's a sort of addiction, most people come home and they just turn it on by habit. And if they don't have that entertainment, they feel suddenly so vacuous,
Yeah.
They don't know what to do. And the first step of waking up is to just hear the silence and then make this active decision of first of all, how would I like to be entertained? That's the first one when you're detoxing. And then later on, you will stop thinking about entertainment and you will ask yourself, what interests me now?
Yeah, one thing I noticed is I cut off cable several years ago, and even then I didn't watch it. I was just, kind of paying into the system, as most people are not thinking about it, because I occasionally watched it. I just cut it off just because it was a waste of money, and also it wasn't good for my children. So now we don't have any television, so my routine is coming home is I don't turn the TV on. I do other things, or read something maybe, or catch up on other project that I have at home. But you might have experienced this if you go out somewhere, you go into someone's home and the TV is on.
Oh, yes.
And you notice how stupid it is. The programming,
gosh, yes.
The content is so dumbed down, transparently, it's transparent mind control, manipulation, but you don't pick up on it. But most people need that background noise. They need watching
yes.
it, and I turn it off, have a conversation, read a book.
Yeah. And it's very interesting because if you ever did that, if you go into a home like that and you turn off the television, they'll be just shocked. And then something that looks like withdrawal symptoms.
Yes.
It really takes some withdrawal period. But when I think about how on earth are we going to cycle our systems back to sanity, you very quickly realize, that you don't even need all those people. The people who can't be motivated, the people who don't care. It's already much better to start with the people who do care and actually talk amongst ourselves and figure out, what do we want to do, what can we do, and how are we going to do it? It's a bit like the stock market. Prices are set on margin, and I think revolutions are always they're influenced and entirely run by the intelligence agencies. Yes, of course. But even within those cartels, there are always a small group of people who have a vision.
Well, you have revolutions, and you have revolutions, and the model I think that you're getting at isn't the storming of the Winter Palace, which was staged. Didn't happen the way it was portrayed on film, of course. Most people's idea of the storming of the Winter Palace in Russia is from that film by the Soviet propagandist, but that's not how you achieve a real revolution. Those are always controlled from the top. But there's micro-revolutions. One example, I think, here in the United States is the homeschooling movement, which is motivated much by a religious motivation at first. Then, as more people became more alienated or disgusted with particularly the public school system, but also the private school system, as tuition rates skyrocket, and now you have tens of millions of children that are completely out of the education system. And that core could provide sort of a cadre, if you will, of revolutionaries, just by default. They're out of the matrix in their thinking. And that's, I think what you're getting at. The same with just working around, instead of taking the system on head on, you're working around it and sort of undermining it and making it as much as you can, making it as irrelevant as possible. And if you make it irrelevant, it loses its power. And you're at the same time you're promoting consciousness. And if you promote consciousness of psychological warfare, you neutralize it more.
Yes, exactly. I think what we also need is, publishing much more the methods of the psychological warfare, which automatically diffuses it, in many cases. There are some excellent, YouTube videos, for example, that take apart everything from the really fake news from mainstream media all the way to the false flags. And, I love those videos because, it could be that most of them are entirely made by the intelligence agencies, you never know. But nevertheless, at least they are out there, and you can find all that. And even if now they are mostly made by the intelligence agencies, it motivates people to make their own videos.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so in a sense, I only had the idea to make my own videos because I saw some that I really liked.